بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful.
The Quranic verses that reject the Hadith, Part 1. In the previous video, we have discussed the topic about why the Quranist Muslims reject the Hadith. If you haven't watched the previous video, please click on link on the description below in order to roughly understand why do the Quranist Muslims do reject the Hadith. In today's video, we will be discussing about the Quranic verses that reject the Hadith. Thus, by rejecting the Hadith, these Quranic verses are agreeable with the Quranist viewpoint and its doctrine. That only the Quran alone can be used as the religious laws of the Islamic faith, without the need of the Hadith in order to complete the Islamic faith. But first, we would like to highlight that there are actually two types of Hadith. The first Hadith that we as Muslims are already familiar is the Prophet's Hadith, or the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, that were later written and compiled into books by so-called imams, such as by Imam Bukhari, Imam Hanbali and the others. The first Hadith book that was written and compiled was Sahih al-Bukhari, written by Imam Bukhari. We had discussed about Sahih al-Bukhari and also about Imam Bukhari in the previous video titled, Why the Quranist Muslims Reject the Hadith. The second Hadith that most Muslims are not very familiar is called the God's Hadith. The God's Hadith is actually the sayings of God that through the angel Gabriel was transmitted to Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad later would recite back these sayings of God to Zayd ibn Haritha, who would write each of these sayings of God into a piece of paper. These sayings of God, or the God's Hadith, would later be compiled into a book that we now call the Qur'an. In English, the word Qur'an simply means the reading. So in the Islamic religion, there is actually two types of Hadith. The first type of Hadith is the Prophet's Hadith, which most Muslims are very familiar with, especially the Sunnis and the Shias, which we can also call the traditionalist Muslims. These traditionalist Muslims heavily support the use of the Prophet's Hadith in their religion practices, whereas the Quranist Muslims heavily oppose the use of the Prophet's Hadith in their religion practices. The second type of Hadith is the God's Hadiths, or the sayings of God that were later compiled into a book called the Qur'an, or simply known as the Quranic verses. The majority of Muslims know and are very familiar with the Quranic verses. But the majority of the Muslims didn't know that those Quranic verses are also called the God's Hadiths. Yes, in the Qur'an itself, the Quranic verses are also called the Hadith. But these Hadiths are God's Hadith, not the Prophet's Hadith. In general, among the Muslims, when they are talking about the Hadith, it means they are referring to the Prophet's Hadith. But when they talking about the sayings of God, or the God's Hadith, they are referring to the Quranic verses. It's very rare among the Muslims, when they are talking about the Hadith, that they are referring to this as the God's Hadiths. This is because the Prophet's Hadiths have become very common among the Muslims. Thus, when the Muslims say that they are referring to the Hadiths, it means that they are referring 100% to these Prophet's Hadiths. However, among the Quranist Muslims, they totally oppose the use of the term the Hadith to refer to the Prophet's Hadith. For the Quranist Muslims, the word the Hadith or the real Hadith are actually refer only to the God's Hadiths, not to the Prophet's Hadiths. So in here, we can see a different viewpoint between the traditionalist Muslims versus the Quranist Muslims on the word the Hadith. For the traditional Muslims, the term the Hadith is referring to the Prophet Hadith. Whereas, for the Quranist Muslims, the term the Hadith is referring to the God's Hadith, or commonly known among all Muslims as the Quranic verses. In this video, the title The Quranic verses that reject the Hadith simply refer to the Prophet's Hadith. Because for the majority of the Muslims, the term the Hadith simply understood as the Prophet's Hadith. Thus in this video, in order for us to avoid any confusion among the audience of this channel, instead of just using the word the Hadith, we will be using the word the Prophet's Hadith and the word the God's Hadith to differentiate between the two Hadiths. Thus, in this video, we will use the term God's Hadith to refer to the Quranic verses. And we also be using the term the Prophet's Hadith to refer to the so-called Hadith written by the previous imams, such as by Imam Bukhari, Imam Shafi or the others. Thus, we would try to explain, one by one, about all of these Quranic verses that we would mention below that reject the Prophet's Hadith.
وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا أمم أمثالكم ما فرطنا في الكتاب من شيء ثم إلى ربهم يحشرون.
The first verse that reject the Prophet's hadith is Surah Al-An'am, the cattle, verse 38 above. Now let us listen to its translations. The first translation, all living beings roaming the earth and winged birds soaring in the sky are communities like yourselves. We have left nothing out of the record. Then to their Lord they will be gathered all together. Translated by Dr. Mustafa Kattab, the Clear Qur'an. The second translation, and there is no creature on or within the earth or bird that flies with its wings, except that they are communities like you. We have not neglected in the register a thing. Then unto their Lord they will be gathered. Translated by Sahih International. Please noted that the word record in the Dr. Mustafa Kattab, the Clear Qur'an translation, the first translation, and the word register in the Sahih International, the second translation, both is referring to the Qur'an. In the first translation, we just want to highlight the words "we have left nothing out of the record." Meaning, all the rules and regulations of the Islamic religion have already been contained in this book called the Qur'an. And God is not forgetful and has not left anything out of the Qur'an at all. The second translation also saying the same thing, that we have not neglected in the register a thing. Which means that everything about Islam have already been included in this Qur'an. Nothing is ever neglected from the Qur'an, ever. Thus, in this verse, God already mentioned that the Qur'an is already complete and that nothing is left or neglected from the Qur'an. Meaning, we don't need any other sources other than the Qur'an in order to complete the Islamic religion. The Quranist Muslims already know that the Qur'an is already complete and nothing is left out or neglected from the Qur'an. Thus, based on this verse, this is the main reason on why do the Quranist Muslims reject the Prophet's hadith. If the Qur'an is already complete, why do we still need the Prophet's hadith? It doesn't make any sense. But why do we still need the Prophet's hadith? When God already explained that the Qur'an is already complete, nothing has been neglected, and nothing could be added anymore to the Qur'an. We believe that these two questions should be asked to the traditionalist Muslims themselves. On why do the traditionalist Muslims still need the Prophet's hadith in order to complete their religion? When the Surah Al-An'am verse 38 has already explained it in detail that the Qur'an is already completed and nothing has been left out of it or being neglected out from the Qur'an.
أفغير الله أبتغي حكما وهو الذي أنزل إليكم الكتاب مفصلا والذين آتيناهم الكتاب يعلمون أنه منزل من ربك بالحق فلا تكونن من الممترين.
The second verse that reject the Prophet's hadith is Surah Al-An'am, the cattle, verse 114 above. Now, let us listen to its translations. The first translation, say, O Prophet, should I seek a judge other than Allah, while He is the one who has revealed for you the book, with the truth perfectly explained? Those who were given the scripture know that it has been revealed to you from your Lord in truth. So do not be one of those who doubt. Translated by Dr. Mustafa Kattab, the Clear Qur'an. The second translation. Say, then is it other than Allah I should seek as judge while it is He who has revealed to you the book, i.e., the Qur'an explained in detail? And those to whom we previously gave the scripture know that it is sent down from your Lord in truth, so never be among the doubters. Translated by Sahih International. In the first translation, the sentence should I seek a judge other than Allah means should we believe in another sources other than the God's hadith, which is the Qur'an. The Qur'an, which already contained the truth and already perfectly explained. Notice the words perfectly explained, which means the Qur'an is already perfected without the need to add anything to the Qur'an. As we mentioned before, the real Hadith is actually the Quranic verses, the sayings of God, or the God's Hadith, not the Prophet's Hadith. The second translation also means the same thing. Notice the words explained in detail, meaning the Quran already revealed and explained in details, without the need of another source such as the Prophet's Hadith, in order to explain the Quran. Basically, God already gives us the Quran, containing his Hadith, which is already fully explained in detail. But why do you still need another Hadith, such as the Prophet's Hadith, in order to explain the God's Hadith? Furthermore, the true believers, referring to the Quranist Muslims, would have already known by now that the Quran alone is sufficient to them. They don't need any other additional sources such as the Prophet's Hadith in order to add up to their religion. Finally, God is giving us a warning never to be among the doubters. So who are these doubters? These doubters are those people who believe that the Quran alone is not complete and is not sufficient to their religion beliefs. That the Quran alone didn't explain the verses or the laws in details. Thus, these doubters need another Hadith, such as the Prophet's Hadith or the Fatwas into their religion, in order to complete their belief system. For the Quranists, those doubters include those traditional Muslims, such as the Sunnis and the Shias. This is because, for those traditional Muslims, the Quran alone is not complete and not sufficient for them. That the Quran alone contain ambiguous meanings and is not that detailed for them. Because the Quran is incomplete and not that detailed for them, thus they need additional sources, such as the Hadith, the Fatwas, the Ijma' ulama's and etc., in order to complete their belief system. The third Quranic verse that reject the Prophet's Hadith is Surah Al-A'raf, the Heights, verse 185 above. The translations are as below. The first translation, have they ever reflected on the wonders of the heavens and the earth, and everything Allah has created, and that perhaps their end is near? So what message after this, Quran, would they believe in? Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. The second translation, do they not look into the realm of the heavens and the earth, and everything that Allah has created and think that perhaps their appointed time has come near? So in what statement, i.e., message hereafter, will they believe? Translated by Sahih International. Both the word message in the first translation and the word statement in the second translation refer to the word hadith in this Quranic verse. We also already highlighted the Quranic word hadith with a red circle, so that you can see, with your own eyes, that the word message or statement is actually referred to the word hadith. In this verse, it's already proven that the real hadith is the Quran. The Quran is the real hadith. It's the God's hadith, not the Prophet Muhammad's hadith that most traditional Muslims believe in. So basically in this verse, God is questioning all of us, the real Muslims, so what message, hadith, after this, the Quran, would they believe in? Meaning, if the Quran is the real hadith, so why would you want to believe in another hadith, referring to the Prophet's hadith? Because there is only one hadith in the Islamic religion. That is the God's hadith. There is no such thing as the Muhammad's or the Prophet's hadith. All those so-called Muhammad's hadith were actually fabricated by those imams more than 200 years after the death of Muhammad. The only hadith accepted in the Islamic religion, as mentioned in this Surah Al-A'raf verse 185, is the God's hadith, meaning the Quranic verses itself. Thus, this verse supports the Quranist viewpoint, which only accept the Quran alone as the laws of the Islamic religion, and also support the Quranist viewpoint that reject the Muhammad's hadith because most of Muhammad's hadith were fabricated and thus cannot be accepted as part of the Islamic religion. This is in opposition to the traditional Muslims' viewpoint, which accept and believe in both the Quran and the Prophet's hadith. In the traditional Muslims' belief, you are considered a kafir or a martyr if you only accept the Quran alone and at the same time reject the Muhammad's hadith. As a Muslim, in the traditionalists' Muslim belief system, you have to accept and believe in both the Quran and the Muhammad's hadith. However, this Quranic verse by itself is questioning those traditional Muslims' belief system, which is still accepting the Muhammad's hadith. Actually, there is no such thing as the Muhammad's hadith or the Prophet's hadith. Prophet Muhammad, as a true prophet, never say anything outside of the Quran. meaning he never said anything that was outside of the God's revelations or the God's hadith that was revealed to him through the angel Gabriel. This so-called the Muhammad's hadith or the Prophet's hadith is actually a slander and a mockery to Prophet Muhammad himself. The truth is, this so-called Muhammad's hadith or the Prophet's hadith should actually be called the Imam's hadiths. This is because, during the lifetime of Muhammad and 200 years after his death, there was no such thing as the Prophet's hadith. The Prophet hadith, or the right terminology, we should call it the Imam's hadiths, were actually the written hadiths by these so-called Imams that were written more than 200 years after the death. All Imam's hadiths did finally exist.
لقد
The fourth Quranic verse that reject the Prophet's hadith is Surah Yusuf, Joseph, verse 111, as mentioned before. The translations are as below. The first translation, in their stories there is truly a lesson for people of reason. This message cannot be a fabrication, rather, it is a confirmation of previous revelation, a detailed explanation of all things, a guide, and a mercy for people of faith. Translated by Dr. Mustafa Kattab, the Clear Qur'an. The second translation, there was certainly in their stories a lesson for those of understanding. Never was it, i.e., the Qur'an, a narration invented, but a confirmation of what was before it, and a detailed explanation of all things and guidance and mercy for a people who believe. Translated by Sahih International. Both translations explain that the stories in the Qur'an is a lesson for people of reason or those of understanding. Who are these people? These people are the people who use their head, who use their logical and critical thinking in order to come to a conclusion or understanding of the Qur'an, instead of those people who just follow blindly to an imam or to an ulama. But what we want to highlight in this verse is the word a detailed explanation, which means the Qur'an is already a detailed explanation. Only those people who use their logical and critical thinking, meaning the people of reason, that would be given the guidance by God to understand the verses of the Qur'an without the need of additional sources such as the Prophet's hadith in order to understand the verses of the Qur'an. So why do you still need the hadith when God already told us that the Qur'an is already a detailed explanation? So, why should you need additional sources other than the Qur'an if the Qur'an itself is already a detailed explanation? In addition, look up the red circles. The first red circle on the Quranic Arabic verse is the word hadith. The second red circle in the first translation refer to the word message. And the third red circle refer to the word it, or referring it to the Qur'an. Thus, the word hadith in this verse refer to the Qur'an, not referring to the Prophet's hadith. Again, in this verse, it is proven that the real hadith is the Qur'an, or the God's hadith, not the Prophet's hadith. Again, this verse, Surah Yusuf verse 111, reject the Prophet's hadith. Based on this verse, the hadith, or the real hadith refer to the Quranic verses itself. It's the God's hadith, not the Prophet's hadiths. Thus, this hadith, or the Qur'an, or the God's hadith, is not a fabrication. Meaning, it's the truth, because it's God revelations that are coming from God. Whereas, the Prophet's hadith is a fabrication, because it's not God's revelations, and thus didn't coming from God. This verse also supports the viewpoint and doctrine of the Quranists, who reject the Prophet's hadiths. Because there can be only one hadith in the Islamic religion, and that is the God's hadith or the Quranic verses itself. This is the end of part 1. We will continue with another video in part 2 about the Quranic verses that reject the Prophet hadith. And thus, these 4 Quranic verses mentioned before totally support the Quranists' viewpoint and doctrine that reject the Prophet.